Mr. Henry took a careful step closer, his weathered hands resting lightly on the wooden fence that separated his farm from the vast unknown beyond. His warm brown eyes, filled with years of experience and gentle wisdom, studied the boy before him. William Wellington's fine clothes were rumpled, his polished shoes caked in mud, and his delicate hands clutched the crumpled map like a lifeline. Mr. Henry could see the boy's chest rising and falling rapidly, the weight of fear evident in his every movement. "You all right there, son?" Mr. Henry repeated, his voice as steady as the earth beneath them. William swallowed hard, his blue eyes darting around the field as if searching for a familiar landmark, but all he saw were rows of crops swaying in the evening breeze and the distant outline of the farmhouse. He looked utterly out of place against the rustic backdrop. I don't know how I got here," he murmured, his voice trembling. "I was trying to follow this map, but—" He held it out with shaking hands, the ink slightly smudged from his sweaty grip. Mr. Henry knelt beside him, his movements slow and deliberate. "Well now," he said kindly, taking a glance at the map. It was hastily drawn, likely by a child's hand, with crude lines and arrows pointing in different directions. "Looks like you've been on quite the adventure." William wiped his nose on his sleeve, his face flushed with a mix of embarrassment and exhaustion. "I didn't mean to come this far," he admitted. "I was just trying to find the old oak tree." Mr. Henry nodded knowingly. "The old oak, huh? That's a good ways from here, but you're not too far off." He glanced at the horizon, where the last rays of sunlight painted the sky in hues of orange and pink. "Come on, let's get you back before it gets dark. Your folks must be worried sick." The boy hesitated for a moment, then nodded. Mr. Henry stood up and extended his hand. William looked at it warily before slowly placing his small, trembling hand in Mr. Henry's calloused one. Together they began walking through the tall wheat, the golden stalks whispering in the breeze. As they walked, Mr. Henry spoke softly, pointing out different parts of the farm, the rows of corn stretching endlessly, the lazy cows grazing by the barn, and the old scarecrow that stood like a silent guardian over his land. Slowly, William's tension eased, and curiosity began to replace his fear. "Do you live here all alone?" William asked after a while, his voice quieter now. Mr. Henry chuckled. "Just me and the animals, and the land keeps me busy enough," he said. "But it's a good life. Simple, honest." William nodded thoughtfully. "My father says farmers work hard but don't get very far," he said, his youthful honesty cutting through the cool evening air. Mr. Henry smiled gently, but didn't correct him. "Well, your father's got his own way of seeing things," he said. "But I reckon getting far isn't always about the money in your pocket. Sometimes it's about the peace in your heart." William was silent for a moment, mulling over Mr. Henry's words. As they approached the edge of the farm, where the well-paved roads of the town met the dirt paths of the countryside, a sleek black car was parked haphazardly by the roadside. A tall, imposing figure stood beside it, pacing nervously. The man's face lit up with relief the moment he spotted William. "William!" he called, rushing forward. It was Mr. Wellington, the town's wealthiest businessman, his tailored suit and polished shoes contrasting starkly against the dusty backdrop of Mr. Henry's farm. "Dad!" William cried, running to his father's embrace. Mr. Wellington held his son tightly before pulling back and looking him over, his expression shifting from relief to irritation. "What were you thinking, wandering off like that?" he scolded. Then his eyes landed on Mr. Henry, and his face hardened. "You found him?" Mr. Wellington asked, his voice clipped and formal. Mr. Henry nodded. "He wandered onto my land, sir. I just made sure he got back safe." Mr. Wellington's gaze lingered on the farmer, and though he muttered a quick, "Thank you," it lacked sincerity. He turned back to his son, brushing off the dirt on his fine clothes. "Let's get you home," he said. As they turned to leave, William glanced back at Mr. Henry. "Thank you, Mr. Henry," he said, his voice earnest. Mr. Henry tipped his hat with a warm smile. "You take care now, son." As the car drove away, Mr. Henry stood by the fence, watching the dust settle in its wake. He sighed, patting the wooden post gently. The world beyond his farm hadn't changed much, but tonight he had planted a seed in young William's mind, one that might one day grow into something unexpected. As Mr. Henry led William down the dirt path toward his farmhouse, the golden wheat swayed gently in the evening breeze. William hesitated, eyeing the muddy patches along the way and tugging at the hem of his expensive jacket. "My dad's gonna be so mad," he murmured under his breath, his small fingers tightening around the crumpled map in his hand. Mr. Henry chuckled softly, his deep voice warm and reassuring. "Sometimes getting lost is how we find our way, son," he said with a knowing smile. "A little dirt never hurt nobody." William sighed, but followed him, stepping carefully to avoid the thickest parts of the mud. The farmhouse came into view, a charming, weathered structure with a welcoming front porch, the scent of fresh hay and warm earth hanging in the air. A dim light flickered from the kitchen window, and the gentle clucking of hens could be heard from the nearby coop. Once inside, William sat nervously at the wooden kitchen table, his eyes darting around the cozy space. The farmhouse was unlike anything he was used to. No gleaming chandeliers or marble countertops, just simple comforts. The walls were lined with shelves filled with old books, mason jars, and framed pictures that seemed to tell a story of their own. A quilted blanket rested on the back of the worn sofa, and the faint crackle of a nearby radio hummed through the air. Mr. Henry moved about the kitchen with practiced ease, pulling out a loaf of homemade bread and slicing it thick. He placed a bowl of steaming stew in front of William, the rich aroma making the boy's stomach growl despite his nerves. "Eat up, son," Mr. Henry said, settling into the chair across from him. "A full belly helps clear the mind." William hesitated for a moment before taking a small bite. The warmth of the meal seemed to melt some of the tension from his shoulders. As he ate, he slowly began to open up. "I had a fight with my dad," he admitted, staring down at his bowl. "He's always pushing me to be perfect. I just wanted to get away, even if it was just for a little while." Mr. Henry nodded thoughtfully, stirring his own bowl. "Parents want the best for their kids, but sometimes they forget that the best ain't always what they think it is." William's eyes flickered with understanding, and for the first time that evening, he felt a sense of relief. "I just wanted to find the old oak tree," he said, his voice quiet. "My mom used to take me there before she passed. I thought maybe... I don't know, I thought being there would make me feel closer to her." Mr. Henry's gaze softened. "That old tree's seen more memories than most folks around here. Your mom must have been real special." "She was," William whispered, a sadness creeping into his voice. As they continued talking, Mr. Henry's eyes drifted to the boy's backpack resting on the floor beside him. It looked heavier than it should for a simple adventure, and when William shifted slightly, the side of the bag gaped open just enough for Mr. Henry to catch a glimpse inside. His brow furrowed when he saw a neat bundle of cash, an expensive watch that looked far too extravagant for a boy his age, and several documents tucked tightly inside a hidden compartment. Mr. Henry took a slow, deep breath, his instincts kicking in. Something wasn't right, but he didn't say anything, at least not yet. He watched William carefully, noting the tension that crept back into the boy's face as he realized the bag had shifted open. Sensing the sudden change in atmosphere, William quickly zipped the bag shut and pulled it closer to his side. I should probably get going," he mumbled, pushing his half-empty bowl away. "My dad's probably looking for me." Mr. Henry leaned back in his chair, resting his hands on the table thoughtfully. "All in good time, son," he said slowly. "No need to rush." He could see the conflict in the boy's eyes, the fear, the uncertainty, and something else, something deeper. William's gaze darted to the clock on the wall, and his fingers fidgeted with the strap of his bag. "I didn't steal it," he blurted out suddenly, his voice defensive but laced with worry. I found it, and I didn't know what to do." Mr. Henry nodded, his voice steady. "All right, son, I ain't accusing you of nothing, but sometimes carrying a heavy load alone ain't the best way to deal with things." William bit his lip, staring down at the table. The weight of whatever he was holding on to was written all over his face. Mr. Henry knew that this wasn't just about getting lost in the fields, it was about something far more complicated. "Tell you what," Mr. Henry said after a pause, his voice calm and reassuring. "Why don't we finish up here, and then we'll figure out the best way to set things right. Together." William hesitated but eventually nodded, a hint of trust creeping into his eyes. For the first time in a long time, he felt like he wasn't alone in carrying his burden. Mr. Henry patted his shoulder gently. "We'll figure it out, son. One step at a time." The evening air inside the farmhouse had grown thick with anticipation. Mr. Henry sat at the kitchen table deep in thought, while William nervously fidgeted with his backpack. The weight of the boy's secret hung heavily in the room, but Mr. Henry knew they couldn't handle it alone. He reached for the old rotary phone on the wall, dialing the sheriff's number to let him know William was safe. Before he could finish the call, the distant hum of engines filled the night air, followed by the piercing glare of headlights flooding the windows. Mr. Henry stood, his brow furrowing as the sound of hurried footsteps approached the farmhouse. The front door burst open, and in strode Mr. Wellington, his face a mixture of fury and relief, flanked by a group of well-dressed men who looked more like businessmen than concerned parents. "Where have you been?" Mr. Wellington bellowed, his voice echoing through the small house as he stormed toward his son. His hands gripped William's arm roughly, yanking him forward with a force that made the boy wince. "Do you have any idea how worried I've been? Running off like that, what were you thinking?" William's lip trembled, his eyes darting to Mr. Henry for support. The older man stepped forward, his calm yet firm presence commanding the room. "Hold on now," Mr. Henry said evenly, placing a steady hand between father and son. "Let the boy speak." Mr. Wellington's glare shifted to Mr. Henry, his nostrils flaring in frustration. "This is none of your business, old man," he spat. "I'll handle my son." Before tensions could escalate further, the front door creaked open once more, and the sheriff walked in. The room grew quieter as his imposing figure scanned the scene, his eyes narrowing at the sight of Mr. Wellington and his entourage. "Evening, Henry," the sheriff said, his voice gravelly and measured. "Got a call that William here was missing." Mr. Henry nodded, glancing at the boy. "He's safe, Sheriff, but I think there's more to this than just a missing kid." All eyes turned to William, who stood frozen, his small hands clutching his backpack tightly. He swallowed hard and, in a trembling voice, began to speak. I heard something," he stammered, looking down at his shoes. "I overheard my dad and some of his friends talking about things they shouldn't be doing." The room fell into stunned silence. Mr. Wellington's face darkened, his grip on William's arm tightening slightly. "What nonsense are you talking about?" he snapped, his voice rising. William took a deep breath, his gaze steadying as he finally found the courage to speak his truth. "Money laundering, corrupt land deals," he said, his voice stronger now. "You're buying up farms, forcing people like Mr. Henry off their land. I found the papers in your office, and I took them." A collective gasp rippled through the room, and all eyes went to the backpack sitting heavily on the table. The sheriff's expression turned serious as he stepped forward, opening the bag and pulling out the bundle of cash, the expensive watch, and the stack of documents neatly tucked inside. He flipped through them, his brow furrowing deeper with each page, Mr. Wellington's face drained of color. This is ridiculous," he stammered, his usual composed demeanor crumbling. "He's just a child. He doesn't know what he's talking about." Mr. Henry exchanged a glance with the sheriff, his gaze full of quiet understanding. "Looks like the boy knew exactly what he was doing," he said gently, resting a reassuring hand on William's shoulder. "And I reckon he did the right thing." The sheriff nodded slowly, turning to face Mr. Wellington, his expression unreadable. "These documents paint a different picture, Mr. Wellington," he said, his tone heavy with authority. "I'm going to need you to come down to the station for some questioning." Panic flickered across Mr. Wellington's face, but he quickly masked it with an angry sneer. "This is absurd," he barked. "Do you have any idea who you're talking to?" The sheriff didn't flinch. "I do, But I also know that nobody's above the law." He gestured toward the door. "Let's go." Reluctantly, Mr. Wellington released his grip on William and straightened his suit, shooting his son a look of cold disappointment. "You have no idea what you've done," he muttered under his breath before storming out, his entourage trailing behind him. As the sheriff followed, he paused by Mr. Henry and William. "You did good, kid," he said to William, tipping his hat to Mr. Henry. "And Henry? Thanks for looking out for him." Mr. Henry nodded, his eyes softening as he looked down at the boy. "He's a good kid, Sheriff. Just needed someone to listen." After they left, the farmhouse grew quiet once more. William sat down, exhausted but relieved. "I thought I was doing the right thing," he said softly, looking at Mr. Henry with wide, uncertain eyes. Mr. Henry smiled, his face full of pride. "You did more than that, son. You stood up for what's right, and that takes more courage than most folks have." William smiled back, a sense of relief settling over him as he realized he had found an unexpected ally in Mr. Henry, and in that moment he knew that despite everything, he wasn't alone. Word spread like wildfire through the small southern town. The Wellingtons, once seen as an untouchable force of wealth and influence, were now under investigation, their pristine reputation tarnished by whispers of corruption and greed. The news traveled from the bustling diner to the barber shop, from church pews to the local grocery store. At first, the townspeople were skeptical. After all, the Wellingtons had been a pillar of the community for generations. But as more details emerged, doubts gave way to an undeniable truth. For years, many in town had harbored suspicions about the Wellington family's shady dealings. Farmers whispered about unfair land acquisitions, business owners grumbled about suspicious partnerships, and townsfolk speculated about how they always seemed to be one step ahead of the law. Yet no one had ever dared to speak out, until now. William's brave confession, backed by Mr. Henry's unwavering support, gave the community the courage they had long lacked. At first, there were murmurs of disbelief. Some questioned Mr. Henry's motives, wondering if he had exaggerated the situation for attention. "He's just a farmer," they said. "What does he know about business affairs?" But William, standing firm beside Mr. Henry, silenced the skeptics with his unwavering honesty. He recounted everything, the arguments he overheard, the evidence he had found, and his fear of what his father's actions might mean for the people of the town. His earnestness, combined with Mr. Henry's quiet strength, made it impossible to ignore the truth. Slowly, attitudes began to shift. People who had once driven past Mr. Henry's farm without a second glance now stopped by to offer their support. Some brought him fresh-baked pies and warm handshakes, while others came with heartfelt apologies for the years of indifference. "I misjudged you, Henry," old Mr. Jenkins, the town's grocer, admitted one afternoon. "I always thought you just kept to yourself, but now I see you were looking out for us all along." Even those who had once looked down on Mr. Henry began to respect him. The same businessmen who had dismissed him as just another aging farmer now recognized him as a man of integrity, a man who had done what none of them had the courage to do: stand up to the Wellingtons. Church congregations whispered about his kindness, how he had taken William in without hesitation, feeding him and offering him comfort without expecting anything in return. Parents told their children stories of his bravery, turning him into a local legend of sorts, proof that one person, no matter how humble, could make a difference. But amidst the newfound recognition, Mr. Henry remained the same steady, humble man he had always been. When people thanked him, he simply tipped his hat and said, "Just did what was right, that's all." He continued tending to his farm, rising before the sun to care for his animals, and greeting each day with the same quiet resilience that had always defined him. For William, the transformation in the town's attitude toward Mr. Henry was heartening. He had never known the farmer before that fateful day, but now he saw him as more than just a kind old man. He was a role model, someone who had shown him that doing the right thing wasn't always easy, but it was always worth it. One afternoon, as William sat on Mr. Henry's porch, watching the sun set over the golden fields, he turned to him and said, "You changed a lot of things, Mr. Henry. People see you differently now." Mr. Henry chuckled softly, rocking in his old wooden chair. "I didn't change a thing, son. Folks just started looking a little closer, that's all." The investigations into the Wellingtons continued, and though the outcome remained uncertain, the town had already changed in ways no one had expected. The once invisible farmer had become a beacon of courage and honesty, and William, once just a scared boy clutching a map, had become a symbol of resilience and truth. Together they had proven that standing up for what's right could bring about real change, even in the quietest corners of the world. As the weeks passed, the town watched closely as the investigation into Mr. Wellington's dealings unraveled. Charges were filed, businesses distanced themselves, and the once unquestioned authority of the Wellington name crumbled under the weight of undeniable evidence. The once powerful tycoon who had dictated the town's affairs with an iron fist now faced legal consequences, his influence fading with each revelation. Amid the turmoil, William found an unexpected source of comfort: Mr. Henry. The old farmer, who had once been invisible to the town's elite, became William's anchor in the storm of his family's scandal. Drawn to the simplicity and honesty of farm life, William began visiting Mr. Henry's farm regularly, eager to learn lessons that no amount of wealth had ever taught him. At first, he struggled with the physical demands of the farm. His soft hands, accustomed to polished silverware and expensive gadgets, grew calloused from working the soil. He learned how to tend to the animals, repair fences, and appreciate the quiet rhythm of nature. Through it all, Mr. Henry was patient, offering him small lessons in humility and perseverance. "Hard work's a funny thing," Mr. Henry told him one afternoon as they mended a broken fence. "It doesn't ask where you come from or how much money you got. It just asks for effort." William nodded, wiping the sweat from his brow. "I never thought I'd enjoy this," he admitted. "Back home, everything's so complicated." Mr. Henry smiled knowingly. "Life's only as complicated as we make it, son." As time went on, William's visits became more frequent. He found solace in the farm's simplicity and in Mr. Henry's quiet wisdom. It was a stark contrast to the world he had grown up in, where perfection was expected, appearances were everything, and failure wasn't an option. Here, on the farm, mistakes were lessons, not failures. Meanwhile, the town, once indifferent to Mr. Henry's struggles, began to rally around him. Inspired by his courage and the light he had shone on the Wellingtons' corrupt dealings, local farmers banded together to protect their land. They formed alliances, shared resources, and vowed to resist the corporate greed that had threatened their way of life for so long. Meetings were held in Mr. Henry's barn, where once-forgotten neighbors gathered to discuss strategies and support each other. The sense of community that had long been eroded by social divides was beginning to take root again. William, too, found himself playing a part in this newfound unity. He became a voice for change within his own family, standing up to the remnants of his father's influence. At family gatherings, he spoke about the importance of fairness, the value of hard work, and the need to make things right. His words carried weight, not because of his name, but because of the sincerity behind them. One afternoon, as William worked alongside Mr. Henry harvesting the golden wheat under a warm autumn sun, he looked up and smiled. The fields stretched out before him, endless and filled with promise. "I think I found my way after all," he said, his voice filled with a quiet confidence. Mr. Henry chuckled, patting him on the back. "Told you, son. Sometimes getting lost helps you find what matters most." William looked around at the farm that had become his sanctuary. He had arrived lost and uncertain, burdened by secrets he didn't know how to carry. But here, in the midst of honest work and genuine kindness, he had found clarity and purpose. Back in town, the community had also changed. The lines that once divided people by wealth and status were beginning to blur. Shopkeepers who had once catered exclusively to the elite now extended kindness to the farmers who had always been the backbone of the town. Children played together without the weight of social expectations, and families gathered at community events with a newfound sense of belonging. The story of a lost boy and the farmer who had taken him in became something of a legend, a reminder that kindness, integrity, and the courage to do what's right could bring people together in ways no one had imagined. And as Mr. Henry and William stood side by side, looking out over the fields, they both understood that the greatest riches in life weren't measured by money or power, but by the connections we forge, the honesty we uphold, and the resilience that carries us forward. In the end, the town stood together, inspired by the unlikeliest of friendships, a wealthy boy seeking direction and a humble farmer who had always known the way.